So call to order the special board of directors meeting for transit funding workshop for May 27th, 2025. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
City of West Sacramento.
Here.
City of Winters.
Here.
County of Yolo.
Here.
City of Davis.
Here.
City of Woodland.
Here. Thank you. Thank you very much. We need approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to tonight's agenda? Director Bernstein.
No changes, Madam Vice Chair.
Any changes from the directors?
No.
Seeing none, I would accept the motion.
So moved.
So moved by Vega, seconded by Ferrex. We have roll call vote tonight.
City of West Sacramento.
Aye.
City of Winters. Aye. County of Yolo. Aye. City of Davis.
Aye.
City of Woodland. Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. We will move to public comment. Comments for public regarding matters on the consent calendar or items not on agenda, but within the purview of Yolo Transportation District. And just a reminder that the board of directors is prohibited from discussing those items that aren't on our agenda. Any public comment? In person? Any online?
No public comment online.
Seeing none, we will move to the consent calendar. Our consent calendar tonight will be presented by our executive director.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So we just have 3 items on the consent calendar tonight. We have approval of the board minutes for the meeting of May 12th. We have a third quarter operating and capital status report, budget status report, and an internal controls update. And then we have this is an annual resolution designating signature authority for our bank account with Yolo County. This is something we do once a year. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd be looking for a motion.
I'll move consent.
Right.
Well, second.
Moved by Chapman, seconded by Ferrex. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
City of West Sacramento.
Aye.
Aye.
City of Woodland.
Aye. Thank you. Moving right along to our regular calendar. Tonight's regular calendar is information only. We will not be voting on any items. This section will be presented by our executive director on Thursday.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chair, and welcome everyone to our special transit funding workshop. I want to start with some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. We are still waiting on one of our speakers to arrive, but hopefully she's probably stuck in the same traffic that everyone's been impacted by tonight. So hopefully she'll be here soon. But just to take a step back, why are we here tonight? Well, transportation funding, I don't think is news to anyone in this room, is unbelievably complex. Transit funding, even more so, I would say, than other aspects of transportation funding. There's so many pots of funding that each have their own rules and requirements, and they all pass through many hands, leading to confusion about roles and responsibilities. Here in Yolo County, we have some special characteristics which make our funding situation even more complex than some other transit agencies. This can make transit funding daunting for decision makers, let alone the general public, to understand, which in turn can undermine trust and transparency. So the idea to host a series of transit funding workshops was born out of last year's budget process, where there was so many questions coming up about what the nature of different funding sources was and what all is going to happen in the future as transit funding starts to erode. Like many transit agencies, we're experiencing rising costs and declining ridership brought about by changes in travel patterns since the pandemic. Fewer people are commuting every day. Meanwhile, costs have been rising from everything from labor to spare parts. So this understandably raises questions about the long-term viability of our transit system here in Yolo County. Last year, we were restoring services that had been suspended since COVID, and there was questions that came up: can we afford to do this? Can we afford to do this over this year, next year, and the next 5 years? So tonight's workshop is the first of 3 planned workshops. We're calling it Transit Funding 101 because the intent tonight is really to provide a high-level overview of the major state and federal funding programs that really are the backbone of everything that we do here, as well as kind of touch on what's just happening with the current political environment and budgetary environment, both at the federal level and here in California, and how that may impact the future of these programs. We're not going to get into the weeds on every single funding program because we don't want to be here until midnight, but we'll talk generally about the major programs, how they work, and their roles and responsibilities at various levels of government. Before we dive in and introduce speakers, I just want to remind you there are 2 additional workshops. In the second workshop, we're going to talk about local funding sources and also how the YoloTD budget allocates costs across our state, federal, and local funding sources. And then in the third workshop, we're going to get into options and scenarios for the future. How do we grow revenue to sustain the transit system we have? And what happens if we can't? What happens if we don't find additional revenue? So that's my sort of high level overview of why we're here. And I want to go ahead and introduce our speakers. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce all 4, and then we'll dive into the workshop. So I'm going to take them in the order that they're going to be presenting tonight, starting with Erik Johnson. Erik is the Deputy Executive Director of Operations for SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. He's worked at SACOG since 2005 in a variety of capacities, everything from May is Bike Month to federal legislation to finance and administration. And a fun fact I learned about Erik is that he did his master's thesis at Sacramento State on why transportation sales tax measures succeed. So he is a true transportation finance nerd. After we hear from Erik, we're going to hear from Amy Changchien, who is with us online. Amy is the Deputy Regional Administrator for FTA Region 9, where she served for almost 20 years. She has a background in civil engineering, and she worked for the Washington State Ferry System before she joined FTA. So welcome, Amy. We're so glad that you could join us tonight. Chad Edison is the Chief Deputy Secretary for Rail and Transit at the California State Transportation Agency, where he has served for over a decade, including 5 years in his present role. And he previously held roles with the Federal Railroad Administration, Amtrak, and the consulting firm AECOM. And then last but not least, Kari Watkins is an Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the Co-Director of the Transit Research Center at UC Davis. She's a leading expert in transit whose research contributes to the goal of expanding mobility options by improving transit, walking, biking, and other alternatives to driving. In 2023, she was appointed by Transportation Secretary Tokes Omishakin to serve on the Transit Transformation Task Force. Welcome, Kari. So with that, I am going to ask our speakers if they would to so Erik, since you're going first, you can grab that mic and stand at the podium. And we're going to bring up your slide deck, and then we're going to take a brief break for questions after Erik and Amy, just for clarifying questions on federal programs, just because we're throwing a lot at you. And then we're going to go to Chad and Kari to talk about some of the things that are happening at the state level. I'll turn it over to Erik.
Thank you, Autumn. All right, thanks, everybody. And as Autumn said, and many of you know, right, I work for SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. And just to set the context, right, we're going to talk about federal and state funding tonight. SACOG really serves 2 main roles. Oh,
Can you pick up the mic?
okay, all right. How's that better?
Yeah.
Is it on?
Oh, is it?
It's
on. It was on.
The mic's on. There we go. Cool.
I turned them on.
You did?
Okay. All right. So let me try that again. So yeah, so SACOG, right, serves these 2 federal and state roles as the Metropolitan Planning Organization over 6 counties, and then the Regional Transportation Planning Agency over 4 counties, both of which include Yolo County. And so as we go through the slides tonight, if you can load that up, we can go on to the second slide for the agenda. So here's an overview of what I want to cover today, right? So we really, at SACOG, really like to start from the high level of planning, right, and long-range planning and kind of where we're trying to go as a region. And so there's a purpose behind all of the funding decisions that we make. I'm going to touch a little bit on federal programs with an emphasis on transit. And then, of course, we're lucky to have Amy with us tonight, who can also go into a bit more detail on anything with regards to FTA that I don't cover. And then I'll spend a bit of time talking about 3 state programs related to transit funding that are managed by SACOG. And I will go into a little bit more detail on the state side. So if you move on to the next slide, as I mentioned, we're talking about our regional plan and our regional goals. And so at SACOG, we've talked for over 2 decades about the integration of land use and transportation. One of the critical roles that transit has is ensuring that people have mobility options in the region. And so when we look to our long-range plan we're developing right now, we actually project that we're gonna have 68% of housing and employment growth in areas that are served by existing transit. And so it's critical that we continue to have the existing transit service, but we also have ambitions to meet our greenhouse gas targets. And so we don't need to just have the existing service, we really need to increase that. And so that's something that we're working with every transit agency to understand that they have the sustainable funding and the support they need from the entire region to meet these aggressive goals. And then finally, I don't want to overlook that transit is also an essential lifeline to many people in our communities. And so that is something to keep in mind as we're talking about transit and what funding needs there are to do that. Next slide, please. So on the federal side, there's really 4 primary roles that SACOG has, starting with planning. Our main role as a metropolitan planning organization with regards to funding is looking at a 20-year vision for what we need to achieve as a region. So in order to receive federal funds as a region, you have to have an adopted plan, and this is what SACOG does for all of our 6 counties. Moving down a level from that, programming is a technical process that SACOG oversees, where we look to both transit, highway, bike ped projects to ensure that they collectively meet our requirements as a region, and they're fiscally constrained. And this is something that SACOG works with YoloTD and other sponsors on an ongoing basis. And as we'll hear a little bit about in a few minutes on the federal side, specific to transit, there's an important and complex role on how funding works across different urbanized areas of the region. And SACOG has a role in facilitating that as the metropolitan planning organization, but there are also different actors, the state of California for the small urbanized areas, Sacramento Regional Transit, that have important roles as the designated recipient. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, on federal roles, SACOG has a role in ensuring that we're complying with federal requirements for transit and working with operators and working to ensure that we support you in meeting those requirements. Next slide, please. Before we get into the funding specifics, I wanted to step back a little bit, because in the current context, right, it's always important to kind of understand where the money is coming from and how it will continue to flow down in future years. And so by way of a very brief 101 on transportation funding, right, Congress passes an authorization bill about every 5 years, which really sets up the framework for programs. And through that authorization bill, programs are authorized for multiple years out of that process. And that sets up some of the FTA programs we'll talk about tonight. It also sets up some of the federal highway type programs that feed into SACOG's regional funding programs, like the Surface Transportation Block Grant and the congestion mitigation and air quality programs. So all of those, again, are authorization-based programs. Things like the infra grant, right? So YOLO 80 was a recipient of that. That is something that actually bridges both the authorization and appropriation process. And so every year, Congress also passes an appropriation bill, and there are certain things that are funded out of the appropriation bill that may not be included in the authorization or may be augmented by the annual appropriations. And so I mention this because it's important to kind of which grant programs are part of the ongoing authorization process and which are subject to annual appropriations. Okay, I think we can go on from there. And before I do that, I will just also highlight something, and Amy may speak a bit more to this, right? There are discretionary grant programs that the administration has some control over in terms of exactly the requirements and the emphasis that they'll have when they release a notice of funding opportunity. And there is still transit funding out there. There's actually a specific notice out currently for low and no emission vehicles that closes in July. And so while there's a lot of discussion about kind of what is the future of the federal transportation programs? Congress is continuing to work, the administration is still working. And we still have an authorization bill that is in place until September of 2026. And this has been a process over many decades, right, where you have these 5-year bills and they kind of reset. And they're typically extended for a year or two. And so in terms of what you as policymakers need to be considering, right, this is the time where Congress is starting to think about what should be in that next authorization bill when it's passed. It may be sometime in 2026, it may be sometime after that. There would be an extension of this, a continuing resolution to move the current authorization bill, the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act, beyond its current expiration date. But inevitably, there will be a new law, which will have new policies and potentially new programs or consolidations of programs. And so this is the time to really start thinking about what goes into the next authorization bill. Okay, with that, I wanted to just briefly touch on some about how the federal funding programs work. So a high level on it in an average year, right, there's about $113 billion for surface transportation in the United States. Roughly speaking, split between Federal Highways Administration, Federal Transit Administration, about 70 billion on the federal highway side, federal transit, close to 22 billion. Federal highways, again, a bit of a misnomer in terms of it's not simply just for highways. These are flexible funds that SACOG uses, the funds that we receive for the programs that we run on a regional basis. But the majority of these funds, about 87%, are suballocated to metropolitan planning organizations, states, to run programs that are consistent with the federal guidelines. And there is about 13% that are available for the nationally competitive grants like the infrastructure infra grant that I referenced earlier. On the FTA side, the split is a little bit more even, with about 50% on formula and 50% on competitive grants. If you could go to the next slide, please. I can talk a bit about the California context. So the FTA funding that comes to the state of California on an annual basis is roughly about $3 billion. And here you can see the split between competitive and formula grants. Just going down to that bottom row, I'll just highlight in an average year, there's about $50 million in formula grants that come to the urbanized areas in the Sacramento region, and between $50 to $100 million in competitive grants. Again, no guarantees on those, but that's about the order of magnitude in terms of how much money is specifically dedicated to transit from the federal programs. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in the Sacramento planning area that SACOG oversees, the 6-county area, there are 4 urbanized areas, and that's an important distinction in the FTA context, because each of those areas has a set amount of funding that comes through formulas to that area. And 3 of those 4 actually are served by YoloTD, the Sacramento, Woodland, and Davis urbanized areas. Next slide, please. Now, there's a distinction in the types of urbanized areas here, and this is set at a federal policy level. Those areas with a population above 200,000 have a bit more local control and a designated recipient that works with all of the transit operators in that urbanized area to determine how to use certain federal formula funds that come to the region, 5307 being chief among those. In the smaller urbanized areas, transit operators work with the state of California, in this case, Caltrans, to enter into agreements on how those are used if there's more than one transit operator. Next slide, please. And here's just a brief snapshot of the current state of who the recipients are of FTA funds in those 3 urbanized areas that YoloTD operates within. And then if you go on to the next slide, you can see a bit more detail about the local decision-making that's happened for the Sacramento urbanized area. dating back to 2015, there's an agreement among all of the operators on how a certain formula would go to each transit operator that operates within the Sacramento urbanized area. Of the 5307 funds that come to us, 88% go out on this formula, earn share. And you can see on the pie graph on the left, how that is divided up into the weighting for the formula. The net result of that is about 3.5% of funding for the total Sacramento urbanized area goes to YTD on this formula, about $1.2 million. So combining that with the other small urbanized areas, you're looking at about $9.4 million in FTA funding on formula to Yolo County transportation, inclusive of the other operators. And I think the next slide is the last on the federal side. So I just included this because, 5307 again is of great interest, and it's something that YoloTD has had access to both in the large as well as the small urbanized areas. So there's a lot more nuance that we could get into, but the very basic level, 5307 is a capital program, can be used in certain circumstances for operating funds. But as with many other federal programs, there's a match requirement. For capital, it's 20% match requirement and 50% for operating. And so, do you want to stop here for federal?
No, let's go ahead with your rest of your presentation. Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. Then. Okay. So shifting over to the state side, as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 state programs that SACOG oversees.
I feel planes taking off.
Yeah, it's really
It's
something.
not affecting people online, but
People on the line so they can hear fine.
okay, very good. I'll
It's just
press.
those in the room.
Yes.
So, 3 programs: local transportation fund, state transit assistance, and state of good repair are specific programs managed by SACOG. Next slide, please. SACOG's role in the administration of these processes of these 3 programs. SACOG apportion the funds to recipients, so these all come through state formulas, and then at the SACOG board level, there's annual estimates that we come up with based on the fluctuations in the funds, and then we let everyone in the region know how much funding is available. And then there's a simple claim process that transit operators, cities, and counties will do to receive those funds from SACOG. And SACOG, while there's some wide discretion in terms of how locals might use those funds, SACOG does have a role in both financial audits as well as performance audits to ensure that we're meeting the spirit of those laws. Next slide, please. So there's also a role for cities and counties. As I mentioned, in addition to claiming those funds, many cities and counties are actually pass-through agents to transit districts and other recipients of the funds. And so these are really should be thought about as restricted funds, right, that are for a special purpose. While they might reside in a city or county budget, they really have a purpose that's been designated by SACOG, consistent with these state laws. But cities in areas where there has been a determination that all transit needs that are reasonable to meet have been met, can also access these funds for local streets and roads. And so cities, in addition to transit agencies, do have access to the local transportation funds. Next slide, please. So the final role here that I want to highlight is with transit operators. So as with cities, right, they are responsible for submitting claims, and then they have the discretion on what they want to select consistent with the eligibility to use these funds on capital and operating purposes, so long as they are complying with the audit recommendations from past audits of these funds and meeting their statutory fare box recovery ratios. So next slide. Altogether, right, this is really a team effort. Speaking just again to the local transportation fund, that's a process where with sales tax that comes in to the region, Yolo County makes a determination about how much funding is going to be available. SACOG takes that information, provides it to the cities and YoloTD, and then you all make claims to SACOG to receive those funds. Next slide. And so as much as we want things to be run on formula, right? There's ultimately a source of these funds, and unfortunately, it's been the gas tax for many transportation sources, and that's not a sustainable one in the long term. And so as we look ahead to kind of, how we pay for transportation, we have to keep in mind which different programs rely on which different revenue sources. Next slide, please. Good news in terms of kind of diversifying our revenues is that the local transportation fund already has some of that built in. It's derived on a statewide sales tax, so 1/4 cent. So that's the good news. The bad news is that consumer spending goes up and down, right? And so the reliability of this really depends on the economy, which may not necessarily be moving in the same direction of when you have the most acute needs for increasing transit service. The next one I wanted to highlight here is the State Transit Assistance Program, which is funded off of a percentage sales tax on diesel fuels. So again, some volatility there as well, really resulting from the fluctuating cost of diesel fuel. And longer term, a real concern that those revenues are going to decline as use of gas and diesel decline over time. Next slide, please. And so zeroing in on specifically Yolo County context, wanted to highlight here one interesting trend that we've noticed at SACOG, which is that there has been a lag in Yolo County sales tax revenue relative to the rest of the region, particularly coming out of the pandemic. And so this results in less funding available to the county for transportation purposes. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, diesel taxes are very volatile. And so the state transit assistance, to the extent you rely on that for capital purchases and others, it's not a very reliable source over time. It's quite easily get. Next slide, please. All right, final 2 slides in this presentation here. First, I wanted to bring in some information on some peer counties in the state and how they use local transportation funds. As I mentioned, there's some flexibility in this as long as you've gone through the unmet transit needs process, which I can talk a little bit about on the final slide. And here in Yolo County, you'll see a little bit more than half the funds are spent on transit, which tracks in some other counties. But you'll see that there are also some peer counties that dedicate all of their funding, nearly all of their funding, to transit purposes. Another interesting thing when you look at some of your peer counties as well is there is permissibility within the local transportation fund to set aside 2% for bike and pedestrian, which is not something that Yolo, Sutter, and Yuba counties in the Sacramento region do, but it is something that's done in some other counties around the state. And then on to the final slide here. The unmet transit needs process, again, is really kind of that determination point for whether funds can be used for things other than transit services. And this is a process that SACOG runs every year and holds a hearing in each county, as well as an online hearing. And I won't go through the whole list now, but I just listed out a pretty robust set of criteria that all need to be met in order to see if a transit need is reasonable to meet through that process. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and happy to hand it over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Eric. So Amy, can you hear us? We'd love to go. Okay, like to provide. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Changchien, and I serve as the Deputy Regional Administrator for the Federal Transit Administration Region I office out of Los Angeles. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you, Eric, for the wonderful overview of the transit funding, especially covering on our behalf on the federal side of things. And certainly FTA, we are one of the 9 modal administrations under the United States Department of Transportation, and we provide roughly $21 billion in fiscal year 25 for the funding through grant making activities to support public transportation across America's communities. And certainly, so grant making is one of the things that we do, but we also conduct program oversight and project oversight to make sure that, the funding that's out there is really truly being used to support public transportation in compliance with all the different federal laws and requirements and such. And so really happy to be here and really seeing that, some of the transit funding being put to good use here in Yolo County and in the SACOG region, the 6-county region here. So really, again, just really pleased to be here joining you all. And if you have any questions, please let me know. But other than that, it's just really wonderful to see that the planning organization, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, SACOG, is doing a great job in facilitating the different conversations, in helping to facilitate different conversations on funding suballocation and funding distribution and planning and programming of projects into the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program plan. So with that, I don't have anything else to add, but we'll stay on with you all for this workshop in case you have any questions. So thank you for the opportunity again, Autumn, for inviting us here.
Thank you so much, Amy. So at this point, I want to take a few minutes and see if there's any clarifying questions on the federal funding piece. I know Erik presented some around the LTF and TDA, but we're also going to be hearing from Chad as well on that piece. So I'd encourage you to hold your questions on any of the state funding for now. But if there are clarifying questions on federal funding, we'd love to give an opportunity for Amy and Erik to answer those.
No questions.
Okay, if there's no questions at this time, then we'll keep on moving forward, and I'll invite Chad Edison to come to the podium.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Is this coming through loud enough? Okay. Well, at the state level, we are partners in providing funding for transportation, transit specifically as this topic here today. And that is mostly through the formula programs that Erik just talked about. Much of the state funding is provided on a formula to either the regional agencies like SACOG, which then put that out throughout the region, or in some cases to operators directly. And all of these funding sources have a lot of flexibility on how you get to choose to spend them. They can be spent on operating and capital as long as you're meeting certain criteria of fare box performance and cost growth. And that is not a set of decisions that the state says, we just have to make sure that you've spent them in an eligible way, but they're not really, the decision process is at that local level or that regional level. We do have some funding sources that are more discretionary. I'll get into those in a moment, where we make choices about whether or not to fund this project or that project. But 90% of the funding, that goes out is largely through these formula programs. In terms of other sources that go out, we have programs like the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. We have the TRCP program, and in each of these cases, there are, and LC-TOP is a formula program. It provides money at the operator level, and that funding is supposed to go to providing new services, expanding service, increasing ridership, and it can also be used for some capital expenditures. And then on the Transit Industry Rail Capital Program side, that is really a funding source that can come alongside you as you're growing your system. It can help you buy replacement buses alongside expansion buses. It can help you do transit centers and other kinds of investments that can make the services better. These are the major, funding programs of the state. The last two I just mentioned are coming from the cap and trade funding. And this funding right now is in a program that runs through 2030. The administration and the legislature are discussing extending that through 2045. And so that is causing a discussion of like the overall priorities for what would be funded with that money on an ongoing basis. Transit is a key part of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So we expect that the future funding agreements around a longer term extension of this program will continue to have robust funding for transit. But the actual nature of that is part of the discussion that's going on right now as part of the budget process. So this is kind of the quick overview of kind of some of the state funding programs that we have. I'd like to mention a little bit the SB 125 funding and the Transit Transformation Task Force, because I think this is the part that is probably the newest and also provides substantial one-time funding that is meaningful both at the Yolo Transportation District level as well as at the whole regional level. SB 125 provided funding over what was originally a 3-year period, and that got extended out over more years as part of last year's budget compromise. And it provides $5.1 billion statewide, most of which has already been provided between last year and this year. We sent out just around $2.4 billion last year. There's another $1 billion on the way out the door this year. And then the balance of that comes next year and the 2 years after that. That money has flowed partly, through the SACOG process. That money has flowed to various projects throughout the region. Some regions have already programmed what they want to spend the money on all the way through the entire time period. SACOG is a little bit further behind in that in terms of being about half of what they have access to has been programmed so far, and the other half is going through a process right now that I think will come to us soon. Part of that is funded operations funding for YOLO. So there's about $3 million that is available for operations for YOLO Transportation District. And then we also have, there's also some money for planning studies in there. But this money can also be used for bus purchases. It can be used for other expenditures. On the Transit Interstate Road Capital Program side, that can be used for increasing ridership, as well as for additional operations expenditures. So as this process goes on with the SACOG distribution around the region, those plans then come into our agency, and we identify that each eligible, as long as things are eligible, the decisions that you make locally are the ones that we put into the distribution of funds. Also, once you get these funds programmed, they earn interest at SACOG. So SACOG gets the cash before they draw it down for the particular projects, and that interest earned can also be applied to future spending. So that's the biggest funding program that's kind of directed at additional spending over the coming years. And again, about 2/3 of it has already been provided through general fund and greenhouse gas reduction funds up to this point in time. One of the requirements of SB 125 was also to set up a statewide transit transformation task force. And this was to provide the legislature recommendations on how to provide longer term stability and growth within transit. And there's been a lot of hard work done by Kari and others who serve on that. There are 25 members statewide. I'm the current chair of the task force, but this is really a group effort to get this report written along with recommendations. It's divided into 2 parts. One is really just laying out the fundamental nature of transit and its kind of trajectory in the state. So it's really kind of a fact-finding, appendix that we're putting together. That is the report that just says this is kind of the status of where transit is and how it's progressing and some of the challenges that it faces. The second part of it, and really the focus of a lot of the hard work of the task force members, is on coming up with strategies to help transit be stronger in the future. Just to put this in kind of some key principles that kind of are guiding the work so far. One of the first principles we have is to boost the speed, frequency, and reliability of transit services. There are a number of strategies around how to do that. This is actually one of the areas where we have, some good potential for making, even the YOLO operations, more affordable to operate, because if we can get those buses to move through congestion better, if we can get them into express lanes or HOV lanes, if we can get them through downtown Sacramento when they're dropping passengers off faster. These are all the kinds of investments such as that are like transit priority investments that can help make the operating cost of the services lower, which then gives you money to spend on improving the service and carrying more riders. And so that is really one focus of the task force, and a bunch of recommendations around that. The next is to really increase options for living, working, and learning in near high quality transit routes. This points towards some of the land use and other efforts that can happen with local coordination with your communities that can help ridership on transit be stronger and give us better access to where people want to live and work. And then to deliver an exceptional customer experience with a strong focus on safety. This is really relevant throughout the state. A lot of transit agencies have made significant investments in trying to provide a safer environment for their transit riders. And we're also seeing a lot of recommendations around how to coordinate with non-transportation parts of the state that could help supplement some of the funding available to transit agencies. And then finally, to ensure transit is operationally and financially sustainable with consistent investment, the kind of gaps that are present in the transition, both to zero emission and to sustainable operations are something that we're spending quite a bit of time on. And that's an area that we're going to keep talking about the recommendations through the summer as we finalize our report by the end of October. So we're about to have 3 meetings this summer that are rolling out tranches of the report, where we will have some of our first recommendations developed into a final form, and then 2 more batches after that. We should see June 10th is our next meeting down in Los Angeles. We then have meetings in the Bay Area and in Sacramento at the beginning of August 1st, I think, or July 3rd, near the end of July, early August, and then again in September before we turn the report in October. So with that, I can kind of pause and take questions, but this is where kind of a quick rundown of some of the state funding and some of the work we're doing to try to improve transit going forward.
Great, thank you so much, Chad. I think before we take questions for Chad, I'm looking at you, Madam Vice Chair. We'll go ahead and hear from Kari as well, who's also serving on the task force, and then we can open it up for discussion and question with all our speakers.
So if it's okay, you first.
I'm just gonna pass these out. I had them make enough copies. Here, maybe if I steal the first one, let you pass them down. Enter one. And I emailed it to you too. So, first, Autumn asked me to talk a little bit about what we do at the UC ITSs and ITS Davis, and then I'll get into what I'm handing out. UC ITS was actually started in 1947, so it means that we actually do transportation research across 4 university campuses in the state of California, so UCLA, Irvine, Berkeley, and Davis. So all of us have transit research that we do across all of those 4 campuses. We all work together. That's why you're seeing a document that has lots of references from work that I've done, and Susie Pike, who you might have met, because she's also local here at Davis, but also research that's been done at the other campuses as well. And so the goal of that is to drive innovation and shape transportation in California and beyond through cutting edge research and active collaboration with policymakers and practitioners. So what's a little bit different from other university research programs you might know is that we have a huge focus on actually translating to policy. And we do a lot of work with the California legislature, even federally at some points. And we're also an active partner, including with Autumn and folks at Yolo Transit District. We've done some research right here in Yolo County, looking at how do we improve transit or understand transit better? So across the UCITS campuses, we actually have several funding programs that we use to fund this kind of research. We get money from SB1, and we had a one-time program where we got money in a program called RIMI that was about post-COVID, sort of all of the declines in transit ridership. How do we help beef transit back up again, as well as look at carbon neutral transportation and emerging technologies. Here locally in Davis, at ITS Davis, we have our own Institute of Transportation Studies at Davis, one of those 4 campuses. And we consider ourselves, and have had no disputing, that we are the world's leading university center on sustainable transportation. So that is what our focus is on. Part of that has come through the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, which was created in 2013. And until about 3 weeks ago, when it was suddenly terminated without cause, was a very large federal center that did a lot of fantastic transportation research, funding many of the centers that we have, including on bicycle research, electric vehicle research, energy futures, AV research, sustainable freight research, and our transit research center, which is something that I co-direct with Dr. Susie Pike. We run a yearly symposium that several folks from YoloTD attend regularly. We have a number of amazing students that come to our weekly transit lab, including a few who, as I said, have done joint research with Yolo before. So to get to the document that I brought, instead of putting some slides together, I really just wanted to pass this out. We are coming to the end of this RIMI funding cycle that we had. So you get the not yet pretty version of a summary of kind of what has all of our research led to? What have we found nationally, statewide, on what is the state of transit and the future of transit, particularly in California. And so I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the high level things in here. We see 2 core challenges. This is going to sound very familiar from the things you were just hearing about: declining ridership and financial instability. And that is really what we're trying to address in everything we're talking about in here, and the 2 biggest problems in California. A few things to know: transit ridership, not just here, but broadly across the state, was already in decline before the pandemic. So the problems that were introduced with the pandemic were things that we were already having issues with. And that largely stems to increased auto ownership and the rise of ride hail, but also shifts in where people work and live. So we saw incomes going up, decreases in the cost of automobile use, and that led to decreases in transit ridership. And we also saw new services, Lyft, Uber, as well as increases in transit fares, shifting people away from transit. We also saw that fewer people were living in the cities where they work, and so it made it harder to serve people on transit. And again, all of this was happening pre-COVID. COVID just made a lot of these problems worse, but they were already starting to exist then. What we've seen in California is that recovery has been uneven, with systems that primarily serve the suburb to downtown work experiencing the slowest rebound, systems that are predominantly based on people who were dependent on transit have largely rebounded, while systems such as those in the San Francisco area, where they have many more of those folks who've shifted to commute, like work from home and are no longer commuting, they've seen the worst rebound in transit ridership statewide. And then the fiscal outlook for transit agencies in California has been mixed. You've already heard a lot about this, but part of the work that we've done at the UCITS is looking at changing the existing transit funding programs, including the Transportation Development Act, to align better with state goals, including eliminating the minimum fare box recovery ratio, funding eligibility, including eliminating the minimum fare box recovery ratio requirement, adjusting transit performance assessments to reflect an agency's local ridership market, using subsidies to more explicitly incentivize performance and efficiency, dispersing funds at the regional level to encourage more service coordination across agencies, and establishing a new fund to help with the transition from the reliance on diesel sales tax. So that is one paper in particular that I highly recommend looking up if you want to understand some of this better. In addition to that, this document talks about how the pandemic presented new challenges to transit agencies, a rise in unhoused individuals and operator shortages. At least the operator shortages I know has been a particular problem in this area as well. And we do have some research that talked about ways to overcome those challenges. We've also done a fair amount of research on microtransit and how it may increase ridership. In some areas, they've had problems with it being cost effective. I think Yolo has actually done an excellent job of providing those microtransit services in a way that actually drums up ridership at a more cost-effective rate than some other places in the state, although it's still kind of pricey on a per rider basis. So even more that we could do to help that along would be good. We talk in here about micromobility, which I won't go into because I think it's less relevant. I mean, maybe in Davis a little bit relevant, but we're actually doing research right now on the ties between how do we get people, particularly to Capitol Corridor in Davis, by using the shared scooter and bike services that exist. And then the last part of this really talks about kind of big picture principles that state and local policies and practices can really influence transit ridership and make the transit rider experience better so that we can increase ridership. And so I'll read a couple of parts of this as well, because I think they're key for this audience. Transit remains central to the state climate and equity goals, but its ability to meaningfully contribute to those goals depends on the state actually coming through in a couple of ways. First, in developing more higher density, walkable, transit-friendly places, something that can even be done in more rural areas like Yolo County. And managing private vehicle travel through parking policies, road pricing, and the like. Despite the fact that you have a different development pattern than some of our big cities in the state, I still think these things are very relevant to things that you might think about to improve transit in Yolo County. In addition to that, strategic allocation of street space, creating exclusive right-of-way for transit in particular locations where it's facing congestion the worst. These are things that can make transit more reliable and make it more attractive to riders. And then finally, innovation in scheduling and fares, as well as things like seamless ticketing and travel can really improve the rider experience. So I guess in conclusion, the last thing that Autumn asked me to speak on was sort of just broadly then summarizing all of that. What is it that drives transit ridership? I would say the first thing is service on the street. The more service that you have out there, the more service you're able to provide. That frequency is really what drives transit ridership. It's one of the reasons why the switch from the fixed route to the microtransit routes made a huge difference, because it wasn't frequent enough service for anybody to ever count on those routes to the more rural parts until the microtransit service was put in place. The thing is, if you can also do things to speed up transit and make it more reliable by providing priority in strategic locations, by better locating transit so it's better able to serve your higher density locations, those kinds of things can actually help you provide the same amount of service on, or a higher amount of service on the same budget. So you can get more service on the street if it's going faster and it's more reliable, because you don't have to be putting extra service out to fill those gaps. In addition, any solutions that help you compete with automobiles or other modes, looking at land use and density kinds of things, creating walkable places that transit can easily serve. So local, encouraging developers to think about how they do that developer, can transit serve that property well? Or are you building a giant parking lot between the street and the place where people are trying to get to. All of those kinds of development patterns make a huge difference, even in more rural areas. And then as Chad talked about perception, so safety, cleanliness, these kinds of things really matter. And more of our research is building towards that. Cost, so trying to keep the cost of transit down. One thing that I really hate that gets talked a lot in our industry is the idea of somebody who is making a choice to use transit and somebody who's reliant on transit. And that is not usually a binary decision, a two thing. It's really a spectrum. We've done interviews of your riders in Yolo County, and we can tell you that many of these people are making the choice to own a very inexpensive, high polluting vehicle because transit is really not serving them well. But they don't want to be making that choice. They would much rather be on transit if we could provide transit service that they could actually use for those trips. And then finally, I have to make a plug for information, since that's the bread and butter of where I started my career in transit, is providing really good rider information about where the vehicles are, when they're anticipated to be arriving at stops, all of that. So that when you do have unreliability, when you do have times that you aren't providing priority and you've got a bus stuck on I-80, that at least somebody knows when that bus is gonna get there. So I'm happy to take questions related. I didn't speak much about the task force, but I think we're happy, Chad and I are both happy to talk more about the task force, maybe in dialogue instead of presentation.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Kari. All right, so we have thrown a lot of information at you. Hopefully it's been useful. Madam Chair, my suggestion was going to be that you could have some questions of the panel, and then we can also take a break and take public comment and see if the members of the public have comments or questions that they would also like to add. And I'll just note, Director Early, please, raise that hand so that we can make sure we get your questions online as well.
All right, thank you. Ian? Thank you so much. Do we have comments or questions for the panel? All right.
Yeah, my hand's up. I don't know if you guys can see that.
Didn't see it.
Oh, it perfectly blends into your background, don't you?
I know.
The single.
Jesse, can I go? Madam Chair, Vice Chair. I have a few questions. I'm going to, Amy, start with you, if that's okay. So as it relates, I'm interested obviously in Yolo County and everything that's happening federally. So my first one is, how will potential federal budget cuts or delays impact existing or planned transit services in Yolo County? Specifically, are there any strategies, or what strategies is the FTA using to ensure that rural and small urban counties like Yolo County aren't left behind during uncertain funding cycles?
Well, so thank goodness that we do have an authorization. So it's the IIJA, right? So it is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act right now. And so we're in year 4 of the 5-year surface transportation legislation. And so the funding is written into law. And so we can reasonably expect for fiscal year 25 and 26 that there will be sure funding, somewhat guaranteed that, assuming that Congress continues to appropriate the funding in fiscal year 26 as set into the authorization, I think that will be fine. Then we're dealing with a reauthorization. So right now, I think it is a great time to, reach out to the congressional delegations to ask for their action to continue to support this, the discussion up on Capitol Hill about the reauthorization of the surface transportation legislation. And in terms of the funding cuts, we are not anticipating any funding reduction. Things might be slower, moving a little slower right now for FTA to release certain funding, and especially for projects selected to receive funding under the bus and bus facilities program, or the low or no emission vehicles funding program. because the new administration wants to make sure that whatever the funding program purposes and eligibility criteria is in a good alignment with their priorities. And so we have been seeing that some of the funding has been, released for certain projects as they continue to take a look at what projects did FTA select before this administration came into the office. And then, so gradually you are going to see funding, those discretionary competitive funding being released. In terms of formula funding, that is not being impacted, right? But then the thing is that, through the master agreement and through the different certifications and assurances that we request our recipients to submit is, changing slightly to align with this administration's priority in terms of climate, in terms of, those equity, the DEIA goals and things like that. So things are changing policy wise, but, it is just kind of to be expected with the changing administration. And so, but in general, though, the funding level should not be impacted. And there may be, other competitive funding programs that this administration is going to implement, may have, again, different focus areas and eligibility criteria. So that is just something to look out for. And FDA has traditionally done a really good job in identifying what those priorities are through the eligibility criteria. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so I have two more questions, and this I think is almost a follow-up of to the response or your answer there, which is around the FTA formula funds like 5307 and 5311. I understand that at least what I'm hearing is, hey, likely to stay the same. Is there a world in which it might fluctuate though in the next federal budget cycle? And are there any flexibilities or waivers that the FTA is considering to help small counties like Yolo to maintain our service stability?
So the funding level under the 5-year surface transportation legislation doesn't fluctuate. The certain funding programs would receive, the formula programs that you're citing. So 5307 is our urbanized area formula program. Section 5311 is our rural area formula program. So those formulas are, sort of written into law, so they won't change as much. It is capped by basically the 5-year authorization funding level. And so at least for 2 more years, this year and next fiscal year, it should remain just as they are. There's no telling as to what happens after IIJA. Is there going to be an extension? Is there going to be a brand new law, authorization in the horizon? That we don't know. And how much Congress has in swaying certain, formula or whatever that, obviously it would just also, something for us to watch. But I don't think the goal and hopefully, and we have no way of really, reading the tea leaves or crystal ball in front of us as, we're just an executive branch agency. But I would imagine, and that has been, sort of the case throughout all the past authorizations, right? All the laws like the FAST Act and the MAP 21 and prior, the funding level for the different funding formula programs remain more or less about the same. It was just that IIJA, increased the FTA funding by more than 30%, which is a huge increase, right? And so, but we don't know what the next authorization is going to bring. But generally speaking, you shouldn't be seeing a lot of the steep cuts or anything like that to different, grant programs. You might see some, funding programs, having a change in direction or might be repealed, but that doesn't happen on a large scale at across the FTA level.
And if we are seeing funds coming out slower, is there a world where there might be waivers or something along those lines so that the burden isn't put too heavily, again, particularly on small counties, to kind of float as we're waiting for our funds to come through?
So your formula fund should be pretty safe, that they should be progressing. All the grant applications that you're putting in to obligate the formula funds should not be impacted. It's the discretionary, right? So because discretionary, it's at somebody's discretion, it had a very special, focus in bus and bus bus and bus facilities, focusing on low and no emissions or zero emissions, right? And so those are the ones that are going to be examined or, for the lack of a better term, more looked into deeply by this administration because it wasn't the program that they established.
So that leads perfectly into my last question, at least from me for you. Which is what resources such as technical assistance, pilot programs, grant writing support does the FTA offer for small counties like Yolo to adopt innovative transit solutions like microtransit, zero emission buses, or rural mobility programs?
So that's a great question. So at FTA, we do offer quite a few different technical assistance centers and transit centers that you smaller agencies could go to. On a larger national scale, those APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, that's APTA, that's for for everyone, but really focused on for more larger transit agencies and rail operators and such. But at the smaller scale, you have CTAA, the Community Transportation of America, the association for that. And so locally, CTA and CalAct have been doing a wonderful job putting on training sessions and workshops and annual conferences. And CalAct, they put on 2 conferences a year on average. So those are opportunities where FTA, we have been participating very actively in providing training and, workshops and things like that. To help to provide technical assistance. And then certainly there's also one last thing, and it isn't exactly just for rural, but FTA also has a program called the National Rural Technical Assistance Program, the National RTAP. And they also is a FTA funded program that provides a lot of resources and tools to help smaller operators and operators in the rural areas to become more proficient, and they have peer-to-peer sort of exchanges, and they just have a lot of toolkits and tools that provide that technical assistance and filling the gaps, and they do provide in person if you request technical assistance. And so that's a great resource for the smaller and rural communities to access. If you're newer to the industry, or that you're, you just needed some training or ideas, and you can certainly reach out to the National RTAP. And I'm going to be sharing, I'll share a list of resources that you kind of asked about with Autumn after today's meeting. And so hopefully she can also share that, either post that on your website or just share that with the attendees of this workshop.
Thank you so much, Amy.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated all the questions and all of Amy's depth of knowledge there. Do we have more questions? Yeah. Chair analysis.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for presenting. My question, I'm curious about the task force. Since we're talking about funding, you talked about, Ms. Watkins, you talked about the 4 pieces or I think maybe you did, Ms. Edison, around the 4 kind of buckets that you're going through. And when you look at the last one, was kind of strategies that you're looking at related to, the drop in revenue from the sale of goods that Erik was talking about, right? From the diesel tax and obviously gas tax. So can you share, pull back the curtain a little bit if you're able to, around what are some of the strategies that you're kind of kicking around the task force level for alternative forms of revenue as these continue to go down?
Chad will probably think of some that I don't. This is nearly his full-time job, or part of his big job. I think you can think of it as, some strategies that are gonna work well in the urban areas that, like I said, are really facing, our SFMTA have just not had that ridership recovery, that some areas have had, like LA Metro even is doing much better, because more of their ridership was transit reliant riders. In those kinds of areas, we're looking at more innovative things, like can we do roadway pricing that might be new sources of funding? Can we do, like land value capture so that as new transit infrastructure is constructed, that we actually capture the value of that land? As an academic, I often get asked, like, is there any place where transit is actually paid for by the fare box and it doesn't have to be subsidized at all? And there are some countries in the world where that is true. There are particular lines in many countries, but there are some places where transit actually pays for itself. But it's usually places like Tokyo where it's not just really high ridership rates, but it's also that when you ride the Hongshu line, you see the Hongshu department store and the Hongshu office building. And it's because they own all of these properties that they have provided access to through their services. And then they get the money back from those properties. So we don't have quite the same land use models in America, but we could still recapture some of that value, right? Like when you're building a new transit line that, you know, we're trying those kinds of things. So I think some of those are less relevant, maybe interesting, but less relevant for Yolo County. So I'm trying to think of things that are more Yolo facing.
There are a whole set of potential, ways to raise additional revenues that folks have asked us to like produce some numbers on. So we're not making a recommendation to say, you should get your money from here or there. But I mean, I would add on, things that are tied to employment, things that are tied to hotel taxes. I mean, these are things that are used by other transit systems around the country. And I guess those are all things that you can produce a number and say, if you decided to raise some more revenue this way, this is what that would generate. I think the other part of this is really going after things that lower both the capital and operating costs and raise the ridership so that you are in a better place financially. So that's also something we talk a lot about, and we have some real examples of places that have done that would serve as good models for how to get into a better place financially. As Kari said, the needs around the state are really different in each county, in each community. We have some systems that have very deep fiscal cliff issues. Those are ones that depended very much on the fare box revenues in the past and haven't had the longer distance trips come back. And then we have other systems that have lost a lot of parking revenues, like in San Francisco, that funded transit, and they don't have as much parking happening. It generates revenue for the system. Yeah. Yeah, and so I think that, and I think the other thing is that we've been looking at ways to generate I mean, just to give an example from that Japan example that you just gave, there the employers pay as much as $1,000 a month in a transit benefit that is tax-free that goes to the employee. And so something like 85 or 90% of employers provide the full cost or very close to the full cost of transportation as an employee benefit. And this is part of why they have such high fare box recovery or even profitability of their systems over there, is that it's seen as such a core part of your job that people want that as their primary benefit. State employees most state employees now have 100% reimbursement of their transit expenses up to over $300 a month. As part of the labor contracts that were renegotiated in the last few years. And so as people start riding, as state employees come back and start riding in transit more, I think systems like Yolo County will see higher revenues received as a result of that, because employees have that choice to get up to 100% of the cost, as long as it's under about $330 or $50 a month. I can't remember what the IRS number is right now. But that should help as more people start returning to the office as well.
And I would say that one of the more recent, I think it was in the last meeting, there was nearly unanimous, very high support for basically doing away with the unmet needs process so that all the money coming to transit stays with transit. I think that was something that was pretty unanimously seen as important. There were maybe a few dissenters on the
We
committee.
abstained.
But I think the idea that we're at least not giving away money that should be coming to transit, and that we're looking for new sources of funding, in addition to that, is really important to everyone on the task force.
I had something on the state worker piece. So, right, because we're in the capital region here, I think it's important to just think about a little bit of a level down of like the practicalities, right? And so those passes are things that each state employee has to take some action to fill out the paperwork to do that. Every department has to do that. The transit agencies have a lot to do that. One of the things that we've been talking to some operators about is the potential of having the state actually just subsidize that, much like a fare free program for students is run, right? If that was just baked into a cost, it eliminates a lot of the overhead for that. And it provides an interesting way of sustainable funding for transit, in particular in this region, right, which has such a high state worker population.
Thank you.
I was hoping that we could go to, and I was quickly trying to find the page, but I think it's the peer counties allocate LTF based on local priorities and regional policies page in our packet. Eric, it was part of your presentation. And I'm pretty sure there's no answer to this. And, but if you have any knowledge or any opinion about why Solano, San Joaquin, and El Dorado County use their LTF mainly for transit, while like Yolo County doesn't have that percentage, or Placer or Butte.
I can't speak to that. I don't know if that's something my state colleagues here can, other than to say, right, that this unmet transit needs process that they reference, right, that really is kind of it was an exception in the TDA law when it was passed by right back in the 1970s. And so it's something that I think community by community, there's been this choice in terms of how those funds are utilized. There is a ceiling, right? So when you have a county of a population of over 500,000, you're automatically unable to do that. And I think, you know, in addition to that population threshold, there's many different nuances that have kind of evolved over time, right? For instance, across the river in Sacramento County, SACRT is actually written into the TDA law where the funds go to them in their operating service areas. There really is no unmet transit needs process for them. It is kind of it's important for us and the transit operators, right, to understand kind of what's happening, but the function and the law is kind of it's a lot of process that doesn't really serve to actually help meet those transit needs in the way that the name would suggest.
I think that any follow-up question that I might have might be slightly inappropriate to certain regions, so I'm gonna stop and not ask further, but that graph is a really powerful graph to kind of demonstrate to areas like my area, like, hey, what are you doing with that money? It should be going to transit. Those are my comments. Director Ferris?
Yeah, actually, I would like to piggyback on that, or just sort of pick up where you left off on that, particularly that same graph. I think a couple quick items. One, you know, without going too deep into the dive, I'm not sure that some of those counties that are spending more in public transit, at least per the graph, are, you know, necessarily are more successful in terms of their usage of public transit. El Dorado is an example, or, you know, potentially San Joaquin, don't know, you know, explicitly, but I think, so not sure that, I think being able to use the LTF on local streets and roads, I think is important sort of the usage of those dollars. The question I have actually more than any of it is around the bike and pedestrian projects item that you raised. You said that 2%, as a sort of, there's an eligibility to spend 2% of it for bike and ped projects. So I mean, the question is, why are we not doing that in Yolo County, first of all, and who makes that decision? Is it the county decision? Is it Yolo Transportation District decision? So that's the first question.
Yeah.
The second question has to do with, and I'm just wanting to try to follow the numbers correctly on the numbers that you've listed. It looks as though Butte County is spending 10% of their dollars on bike and ped projects. And you said that there's 2% was the sort of eligibility, I think. So maybe there's an ability to do more than that. I'm not sure, but I'm just curious about, what some of these counties are doing, what is allowed. So 2%, if that is in fact the case, who makes that decision? So curious about that. Again, is Butte County or any of the others doing more than the 2%? So that's the second question. And then third question, I would assume this be the case, that bike and ped projects might already fall under local streets and roads, just generally, potentially. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but I'm just curious about that. So I'm curious about those on that particular slide. I have a few other questions.
Sure, yeah, okay, so Supervisor Fricks, to your first question, that's a relatively simple one, so. The 2% is elective of the Regional Transportation Planning Agency, and so that is a SACOG decision.
Okay.
And in reviewing our files, my understanding is we made an election for Sacramento County, not the other counties. And so that is a policy matter that could be brought to SACOG at some point to set that aside. Now going above the 2%.
Thankfully, we have a bunch of SACOG board members on this.
Yeah, and going above that, that for Butte County, I don't know the answer to that. That's something I have to look into. I don't know. I don't remember all the particulars. It's a 100+ page manual of what you can and can't do, but yeah.
And then to that, maybe that third question, which is just if there is not a designated 2% for bike and ped projects, are bike ped projects eligible under the local streets and roads category of LTF?
I believe they are.
We don't know.
Yeah, I believe they are. It's basically, it's up to the local jurisdiction, or the city or the county
Okay.
to spend those, and so it could be part of a local street project.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Very helpful. A couple other quick items. One, just Kari, really appreciate your presentation and the overview of ITS. Great, so appreciate the work of ITS for so long. The recent National Center for Sustainable Transportation grant that was sort of clawed back by the current administration, federal administration, I think it's really unfortunate that occurred. I think if anybody spent more than a few minutes looking at the work of and the sort of breadth and depth of work of ITS for decades, and I mean 1947 was the original sort of ITS. I'm not sure when the sort of Davis version of ITS started, but
In the 80s.
in the 80s. So okay, great, yeah. So going well over 40 years, or around 40 years at this point, would recognize that the sort of the value that is being provided by the university, particularly ITS, and that has been borne out in countless sort of studies, but also so many occasions. So just wanted to thank you for the overview today, but really appreciate the work of ITS and acknowledge that. I think we could more voices in DC should be listening to the work that ITS has been doing. So thank you for that. Just to Director Early's original, or one of her earlier questions, I would just say one, and it was Amy's follow-up on that, and appreciate that. It sort of discussion of the surface transportation legislation, and IIJ obviously is the current piece of legislation, but just wanted to say particularly to Director Early, but anybody else, I mean, a number of us were in Cap to Cap and the DC trip just a couple weeks ago. And a major emphasis for those of us that serve on the transportation team this year, with every single visit we had with either anybody in the administration or in terms of the congressional delegation of either party, it was all about, urging them to begin work on reauthorization. And, the language may have changed. we were sort of advised to not really mention pedestrians and bikes and, safety, but it's all about safety, congestion relief, safety, safety. So I think just really to say that, I mean, the work that we know that the IIJ doesn't sort of expire for another, a little over a year or so now, year and a half. But a lot of the conversations that we're having, at least on the transportation team, and with all the visits that we had, were all about reauthorization. So that work is definitely, we're sort of at the table, and it's always good to be at the table because otherwise you're kind of on the menu often. So very good work there already underway. One last quick question. I think I'm curious about the STA sort of funds, obviously the diesel tax. There's a footnote in there, or just sort of estimate of declining, by $300 million by 2034. I mean, I'm sure over that, some amount of that is likely to occur over time. Due to obviously the sort of transitions to electrification and such, but given the events of the last few days, sort of news coming from DC, I mean, any sense of, I think, are we really on track to sort of see that kind of dramatic of a decline, given that, we're now gonna have a real challenge in moving towards electrification in California? I mean, and of course, I certainly, but I think probably most of us really support a transition to electrification, but I think that it feels like there are a lot of additional barriers being put up to ensure that California does not make that transition anytime soon, and that we just sort of continue moving in the direction of a sort of status quo situation. So I'm just curious about, I mean, that's kind of a little bit probably just for anybody who wants to answer it. The crystal ball bits, I guess, a little bit, but just, I'm worried about obviously the federal sort of actions to sort of change the direction of what California has already decided. But I mean, it feels like we might just continue to see us having to rely on diesel fuel. I mean, in terms of and SCA funds, especially as that's funded on diesel tax. I'm just curious about that. If anybody has any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can start it off. So, I think from a transit operator, right, you're both a purchaser of diesel fuel as well as a recipient of funding that's kind of built off of that. And so I think, no crystal ball here, but it's definitely a number of ranges of kind of, academic forecasts looking at kind of what the trajectory is. And I think regardless of what happens at the federal level, I think California is going to continue to push for whatever is in its control to push down that diesel usage. I think that the challenge you also have right in the transit industry is the availability of the zero emission fleet. And so that I think is really both it's a pressure in terms of how long you're going to have to be reliant on diesel, but also the price of the vehicles you're going to have to pay for to transition there. Right, it's going to be a real fiscal challenge to pay for those new buses running the same service.
No crystal ball here, but I mean, I would clearly say that.
Or is this part of something the task force is taking on? I guess that's
The price of diesel going up and down a lot.
Yeah.
Actually affects its revenue a lot in the near term.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have watched this happen since the war, when the war in Ukraine started. Like diesel prices went way up, so did state transit assistance, so did intercity rail funding.
Yes.
Like all of these, and then it started to come back down, and right now it's quite a bit lower than it was 1 or 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so we see like that $300 million fluctuation just over the matter of a couple of years as well.
Yeah.
So I would say, one of the bigger challenges with diesel sales and use tax is its unreliability in terms of price, which then affects how much revenue you can count on from year to year.
Yeah.
And while we might get the number, fairly close over like a 5-year forecast, you might get a general sense be in basically the right direction. You can't guarantee it any year. And often our forecasts are not that close to what actually happens.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Ex officio dosage, did you Any comments that you would like to?
If I could.
Yes,
okay,
please.
Sorry, now. Just to follow up on ridership or travel and post-pandemic, you talked about ridership recovery. And it does relate to our budgeting has there been a full recovery in travel? Or is work from home, is travel still diminished and we need to look at a different shift or getting remote shift or people are staying home?
Unfortunately, what we've seen so far is there has been a return to travel at the same degree that we saw pre-pandemic, but not a return to transit ridership. So there's a lot of things at play here. If someone is no longer commuting for their travel, they still sort of have this mental travel budget that they're willing to undertake. They may have previously stopped, to shop on the way home from work, and they still go out to make that shopping trip, but they're doing it a different time of day. And part of it is that we're seeing things like some people are returning to work just a couple of days a week. And this is research I haven't yet been able to do, but I really want to do, is that I think that we've long talked about this travel budget that people have as a daily thing, that like you're willing to commute so much per day. So you're only going to move so far from your work location because, a few 20 minutes commute, 25 minutes commute, that's fine. But people really don't want to do, on average, longer commutes than that. But is that really a daily budget or is that a weekly budget? Is it that if you're only commuting in 2 days a week, are you willing to suffer quite a bit more on those 2 days a week? And so, you're gonna move further. And so we see VMT increases because people are willing to live further away from where it is that they're working, those kinds of situations. We also think that from a pricing perspective, many of the transit agencies have started to evolve, but not completely, to the idea of like the monthly pass being the thing where you buy that monthly pass. And then if you're taking transit every day, well, if you're no longer going into the office more than 2 days a week, there's not a value to that monthly pass anymore. So why are you going to do that? And if you don't own that, well then, if the car's in the driveway, you might as well drive it. So we're seeing a lot of like Capital Corridor. If you look, their ridership is much smaller, but it's not that all the different types of trips are smaller. It's just they've lost the commuters. And many of the other trip purposes are still there on Capital Corridor. It's just the commuter segment has disappeared. So like we're doing research for them right now to try to understand how do they tweak service to try to gain back people for other purposes if they're not necessarily going to have those commute trips because people aren't making them.
All right, thank you. And I do have another question that could be, I think, short. I lost a little bit of the presentation on the origin of the task force, like why was it set up and who does it report out to, and does it continue or it ends this year?
Yeah, so the task force is a one-time task force. It was set up because of the SB 125 funding. It was part of the law that set up the $5.1 billion. It's really looking to provide longer term recommendations that can help provide a stronger transit future. And so this was part of the kind of accountability and kind of recommendations section of that law to not just say, what are we going to spend the $5.1 billion on, but how do we make sure we're setting up a better future where state policy regulation and additional, statutes in the future could benefit transit better and get to a better result.
Okay, thank you.
There aren't any questions. Dante, do you?
I do.
I see it.
I was just waiting. Okay. All right. So I have a couple. One is for Erik from SACOG, which is with, it sounds like not potentially new federal funding streams, but maybe as it relates to discretionary funds and new state climate goals potentially at play because of everything that's happening federally. What are some of the regional transit initiatives that SACOG is pursuing that YTD should consider joining or learning from?
Thank you for that question. So Yeah, SACOG has embarked on a number of things related to transit that YoloTD has actually been a part of. And one just to call out, right, is our next generation transit study where we're really trying to think about how we move into the next generation of transit. But through the SB 125 funds that you just heard about, right, we're helping to pay for the COA that you all are doing, right? And so I think we're really approaching things, at least in terms of a planning process of like, what is the next thing that needs to happen with transit? With regards to funding, right, YoloTD is one of the parties to that memorandum of understanding for the Sacramento urbanized area operators. And so Autumn on your behalf has been participating in those meetings and will be bringing updates back to you on how that's going. And that will be, hopefully an ongoing source of a continued ongoing source of funding. But really looking like at the funds that come into our region through that program. There's an amount that goes out on an earn share, as I mentioned, but there's also a part that was set aside for discretionary funds. And so one of the kind of policy questions we have as a region is, do we keep a discretionary pot? What do we do that for? Are there other regional purposes that we want to utilize some of those funds that we have control over? So those are kind of a few thoughts on how you can connect with SACOG on transit.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I also had a question for Kari. So I'm a triple Aggie, go Ags, and am always looking for ways to partner with research institutions. And so I'm curious what examples, if any, you might have where small transit agencies like ours have successfully partnered with research institutions like UC Davis to pilot cutting edge solutions, and how might YTD, YoloTD build on those kinds of partnerships?
Well, I'll say that you guys are already doing this to a certain extent. So as I mentioned at the end of my comments, YTD has already been a great partner in that when we have sought out research data, or we wanted to do surveys on your service to understand microtransit usage, YTD has always very willingly done these things and let us make use of your resources in terms of giving us data, in terms of sending out surveys for us, and all kinds of things like that. So you're already doing the right things right here. But we've done other work with small transit agencies in other locations where they're actually we're going together on grants where there's an evaluation component to what they're doing, and we will see where the transit agency is receiving those funds to be doing much of the work, whatever the particular project is, but to understand what is the impact of that. It gives us the ability to carry out that evaluation independently as this trusted academic partner, to say that, in the LA area, the mobility wallet funds, I think, are a great example where they've gone after funding to do these kinds of things. And then we've come in and we've done really comprehensive surveys. We've looked at, before and after ridership or mode choice data or things like that. And that is a really great way to partner with us. As an alum, if you want to donate to some of our amazing programs, you can always do that.
I do donate, but yeah, not to this, but I do donate to UC Davis. That makes you feel any.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the comments about the loss of the center earlier. I cannot overstate that the reason that you don't get slides and you get this is because it has been a very difficult month trying to figure out budgets and how we keep staff and students employed. And we're having to reduce an undergrad research program that we do every summer. We're trying to get donors to fund it because we don't know how we're going to do it if they don't. It's a pretty bad situation right now. So if you have any ideas of how to support financially transit research, we really appreciate it.
If I could just one more plug for ITS, the Friday symposiums.
Yeah.
Are a great way to learn about emerging issues or get connected, yeah.
So I've got a few more questions, Kari, for you, but I don't want to leave that thought right there. Just in regards to, I appreciate the fact that we are so willing to share our data. As you, I think, pointed out, that is definitely a part of participating with research institutions. I think that's definitely a sort of like a low barrier entry, though, and would love and welcome the idea of partnering on grants, actively and intentionally partnering on grants to potentially answer some of the more nuanced questions that I think sometimes we as board members have, but our team doesn't necessarily have the time or capacity to really dig into. So I would put that plug there. I have 3 more questions for you, though, around microtransit and the document. Thank you, Autumn, for emailing that you, Kari, that you handed out. As it relates to microtransit, obviously, that we are doing it in Knights Landing, Winters, and Woodland. However, given the report's mixed findings on microtransit and the cost effectiveness that you mentioned in your presentation, what would be some best practices or strategies that you would actually suggest we use to make sure that these services actually remain sustainable and impactful for the rural communities?
That's a great question. We're doing the microtransit research. Yolo County is one of 4 locations that we've been doing this in, and we've previously done research on SACRT's system as well. As we all know, SACRT, you may not know, they were once the largest microtransit operator in the country. Now that program is tiny in comparison. And I think they may have some left, but not much. Yeah. So basically when their pilot ended, they kind of pulled back from using SACRT funds to do microtransit because of the very high price point that they were providing service at. I think like I said, in Yolo County, it has been different because you had such low ridership on those fixed routes when it was switched to the microtransit, that even though it's pretty pricey, your price per rider on your fixed route was actually incredibly high, because even though you weren't operating much, you really had almost 0 riders taking it. So if you have 0 people, it's an infinitely high cost per rider to provide that service. So switching it to microtransit for you guys was actually a really good decision. It has worked very well in comparison. Now, how to do even better? I don't know that I have a ton of answers yet. I mean, I think there's a lot in efficiencies with the service where I think just increasing your ridership, like there has to be a base level of service there. At this point, the more people you get using it, the more efficient the service can be. There seems to be kind of dead times where you really have almost no riders on it. I also think that it's one of those cases where if you could spend a little bit more money, you would actually have pretty big gains in ridership, because I think the service ending at the times that it does, and we have a whole report on this that we're about to hand to Autumn and staff, where we're talking about sort of what we found when we did our ride-alongs and things like that. But people commented about the fact that they could get to wherever they were going, but they couldn't get back home because the service ends at, is it like 4:30, 5 o'clock? It's very early. And so they couldn't do both directions. And so they weren't going to take the one trip because they didn't know how they were going to get back if they used the microtransit. So I think expanding your service hours to be, a little bit longer, where it's not just one person staffing it, where you have a long enough service hours that it's 2 operators that are on that particular, not route, but zone, so that you could get to 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. There's definitely some college trips. There's, people trying to do a work trip back and forth who can only go in one direction, all of those kinds of things. We heard a lot of comments to the nature of they didn't feel like they could use the service. But I hope, I don't want to take up too much time, because I hope that the report we're about to produce. Again, not funded by YOLO, but funded by NCST money. We're about to hand that over so that you guys can see kind of what the thoughts from the survey and the ride-alongs were.
So I appreciate that. Like I said, I have two more questions, but I don't want to leave just this particular point, and hopefully we'll explore it later, which is, I think this is the first time I've heard, and at this point, I think I've been on YTD for 2 years, that potentially our fixed route services were actually costing us more. So I'm reflecting this back to you because of our ridership. So I just want to, I don't know if that was what the intention.
Costing more, but they're costing more per rider, right?
Interesting.
So, and
Okay.
this is not the fixed route services you have in Woodland. These are the ones that were replaced by the microtransit services. So
Okay,
the service
like
that
the
was running to
220?
Winchester, the service that was running to Yolo, is that? And Knight's Landing, yeah, and Knight's Landing, you were, okay, help me out if I don't get this right. You were alternating where you were going to Knight's Landing 2 days a week and then Winters 3 days a week, or maybe the other way around?
It was, sorry if I may.
Yeah.
So it was, Dunnigan, Zamora, and Knight's Landing. That was a
Okay.
trip where it was essentially had service 3 days a week in either of those communities. So
Yeah.
Dunnigan, Zamora, 3 days a week, Knight's Landing.
Okay, but Winters was every day,
Yeah,
so.
Winters was every day. And so
Okay.
not to correct you too much, but in Winters, we actually had higher ridership on fixed route than we do now on
Okay.
microtransit. But you're absolutely right in about Knight's Landing.
Right, okay.
Okay, and I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but I didn't want to leave that point because I was like, wait a minute. All right, and then I'll actually just make this my last question so we could go to public comment. You talked about the report that you handed out. You highlighted unhoused individuals using transit more. And I was curious if you were aware of successful models from other regions that YTD could explore to better support unhoused riders while ensuring safety and accessibility for all of our passengers.
Yeah, so this was not research that I did, but there's a report that's referenced on here that I would highly recommend taking a look at. So it's the one 20, it's called It's Our Problem, Strategies for Responding to Homelessness on Transit. So it was a paper that was done, funded by SB1 Research, and just to come straight from what's written on here, strategies that they talk about in their hub of services. This idea where it's a more central point in the city that you can get all of the needs met so that you don't have to be riding transit all over the community to get various needs met. Is one thing, discounted fares, transportation to shelters. Those were some of the things, but again, this was not my research. And so I recommend taking a look at that report, and I can put you guys in touch. Jacob Wasserman in particular was one of the authors of that, and I'm sure Jacob would answer more questions.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Seeing no further comments, I'd love to open it up for public comment. Do we have public comment tonight? Yes, we do. Right here. Let's figure out the microphone and come on up.
Good evening, thank you, Michael Barnbaum. So I'll start just by saying City of Sacramento, County of Sacramento, and the Sacramento State. Stingers up, go Sacramento. Yes, and on the big day of giving, I was a donor to the Alumni Association.
Well, thank you.
Yes, so yeah, they were on the list. I said, oh, why not? So, I apologize, first of all, for walking in about 20 to 25 minutes late, and that was due to major traffic on I-80, trying to get the trip at 5:13, arrived late on J and 8th. And so I arrived late and was doing a play-by-play to the chief operating officer about where the bus was as things were happening. Sorry that they're not here this evening. But anyway, so about the part, I think, Chad, you talked about speeding up buses, congestion relief, congestion pricing. And it made me think a little bit about the YOLO 80 managed lanes a little bit. And then you talked about SB 125. So maybe question for all three of you. I don't know who could best answer this. I see perhaps some bright future toward what SB 125 can be used for along those lines. Is that something, we could look at congestion pricing, looking at what the fares are and utilizing future freeway lanes exclusively for buses to catch up in schedule and not be so behind, or having the passenger worry about that there was a trip cancellation due to a late call out or or illness or something. Okay, so.
Yeah,
And then I'm not done. I
how
have
are we gonna
another
do the
question.
microphone?
Oops, sorry. So Madam Chair, it's at your discretion, but maybe you could have the public speaker ask all their questions during their minutes and then.
Yeah, please.
Okay, and then.
Ask all of them at once, yeah.
Okay, and then my second question was kind of going along the lines of Director Ferrick's on the origin and destination studies that were out in previous YTD packets. You talked about the Capitol Corridor. As you're familiar with, and maybe some others are, I put a collage of videos and photos together. I either saw this reaction or this reaction going from downtown Sacramento to San Francisco International Airport via the connection. And I did that 10 days ago. Are we, that was a discretionary trip. It wasn't a regular commute. It was on a Saturday. I went then nonstop on United to Pittsburgh. SMF doesn't have such a service. And so that was the purpose of that. Are we looking at some things like that as part of the discussion of accessing Capitol Corridor, or perhaps even how do we reduce that trip and make it perhaps that people in the region take that trip over to SMF?
I'm gonna
if
stop
such-
you there. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your question.
Right.
You've gone a little bit over. I think
Sorry.
There's two good questions.
If such an air service was offered? Thank you.
Oh. Those are two good questions. Anybody wants to address them? One was the,
I can speak a little bit to the first one on SB 125. I mean, the funding is very flexible in terms of how it can be used, as long as it's being used for a transit purpose. So it can be used to pay for operations of services. It can be used to pay for projects that make those services better. It can be used for the studies that help figure out the ways to make those services better. So there's a lot of flexibility there. That is a process that goes through the SACOG process in this region. So that's how the law is set up in terms of that, and YoloTD certainly and the others in the region could certainly look at ways to invest that money, that one-time money appropriately. So there's a lot of flexibility there.
So yeah, just going beyond SB 125, what I heard a bit in Mr. Birnbaum's question is about kind of, how to make transit more efficient. And I think two things I would speak to. One is the use of ITS, Intelligent Transportation System, right? This is all the technology that you can have to make signal priority for transit in urban areas. And then things like we're doing through the Capital Area Regional Tolling Authority. YOLO 80 is the first project there, right? But really thinking about how do you use managed lanes to provide priority and better efficient service for transit, to some of the things he spoke to. So definitely opportunities to use both federal and state funding to fund those sorts of investments.
thank you.
I just want to add that I think sometimes there is a bit of debate over the use of these funds between transit and between local roads. I think maybe if the intent of the bike ped piece or the local roads piece was to improve transit, so you don't necessarily have to spend money on transit to make transit better. You can be using it to do things like fund signal priority or, some sort of strategic queue jump lane, bike ped funds that are spent to try to access a transit center better, or, all of those kinds of things. You could be spending those things in those other pots, but only in ways that really prop transit up. To me, maybe that's a better way that we should be thinking about the use of those funds in a place like Yolo.
Just one comment on the signal kind of work. This is good for all users of the roadway. So it can be good for cars that are otherwise holding for a light to change cycle. It can be used for emergency vehicles, it can be used for transit. There is much more going on in the signal priority kind of way. That's not just prioritizing a bus or not just prioritizing an emergency vehicle, but rather managing the corridor. And it's gotten much cheaper and easier to do now with all the kind of cloud computing and everything. So I think that is like one of the key methods of like, whether it's in Sacramento or in Woodland or any of the communities where there are corridors and traffic signals at play. That's how we get the buses faster. You don't always need a bus rapid transit lane or a special lane for the vehicle. You need to be able to manage the corridor flow better, and that's good for drivers too. So
Thank you so much. Do you have one?
I feel like we didn't address the second question, but I'm not sure that I don't think we have any control over SMF, but I can tell you that in the research we're doing for Capital Corridor, we're very much looking at trips that people make to the airport and how Cap Corridor could be serving people flying out of SFO better. So hopefully we'll have a lot more on that soon.
SMF better.
Service to SMF. I mean, Capital Corridor couldn't do that, so that study wouldn't do it, but we would be more than happy to help figure out how to do SMF better as well.
Thank you so very much. Do we have more public comment? Come on up. Ellen.
I wonder, question about, we talk about frequency and reliability and fasterness. And then we're very high capital costs, it takes long planning cycles. I've yet to hear anyone this evening talk about bus rapid transit as an alternative to high expensive rail things. And you mentioned that transit services don't pay for themselves. I would suggest I-80 corridor, which is underserved by transit. There are for-profit bus services, and no one discussed that. I'm kind of, no one talks about really using our road system to service buses, to give buses queue jumps to basically, on Russell and Seth in Davis, we didn't talk about putting bus rapid transit, even though that's the highest corridor, highest use bus corridor. We don't want to reserve a lane for buses there. Can road money be used to basically fund bus corridor and bus improvements? So we basically speed up the buses get out of congestion. I mean, Road 102 pole lines should have bus queue jumps at certain spots in Davis, but that's not even on the discussion list. On the Mace curve in Davis, there's plenty of asphalt to put additional lanes so the buses could queue jump around that curve, around the rush hour bumps there. No one's talking about that. I'm just kind of boggled that no one has basically used our bus system because it's much faster and much quicker and much cheaper to do. And I was on the study group, the alternative analysis for light rail to Sacramento Airport. And they looked at a bus rapid transit alternative, which was half as expensive to build, half as expensive to operate, but no one wanted it because everyone was in love with the rail. So we still, 20 years later, after my study, we still don't have a light rail, any transit to the Bay Area. And by the way, the light rail to the airport was took twice as long as buses to the airport than a bus rapid transit system to the airport. So this focus on, everyone's excited about rail. And you know the study in the 1980s, 1990s about basically they built transit and they cut the bus service and transit ridership would drop after these high expensive stuff. We're still caught in these sexy expensive rail systems, and we're still not focusing on bus rapid transit. So can highway money be used to build bus priority things? That's what I question. Why can't we start doing that tomorrow to get buses quicker instead of just always tying it to adding road capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Can road money be used to reduce bus congestion? Was that the first part? Yes.
I think the answer from all of us was absolutely yes. And I think many of the things we were talking about here are actually bus rapid transit type improvements. So I don't know that as a person who has a fair amount of expertise in BRT, this is actually, I think I have a lecture that you would really love to hear about getting lost in technology for technology's sake, and that's often what happens with a lot of transit projects. But in particular, when we're talking about signal priority or a queue jump lane or things like that, these are things that are absolutely, you know, small, not hugely expensive types of improvements that could really make a big difference even in a place like Yolo County. I don't know that you're gonna convert a lane to a bus only, like we just don't have that amount of service running. On the freeways though, the I-80 project, like there are definitely places where it makes more sense, and there are places in Sacramento and such. And BRT as a concept is fantastic. Like we need to be speeding up the buses that we have rather than focusing on a new mode and in many locations. So I would echo the public comment.
Thank you very much. If there are no further, do we have another public comment? Come on up.
I have a quick question.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Olin Woods,
Oh.
and I'm with the CAC, the Citizens Advisory
Oh.
Committee. I don't think this thing is on. but-
It's on, we don't know if it's working though.
Oh, you gotta pick it up. I've been with Caltrans for 28 years and 10 years with SACOG, and it's great to see you. Nice job. My question is for Amy, really. And Amy, it seems, can you hear me, Amy?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
Now, it looks like transit, at least at this point, has been pretty much left alone in terms of firings and so on. And the FHWA has been left alone as well. Is that correct or not?
No.
No. Okay.
Well,
Well,
it's not so much about the firing, so much at this point right now, but we did have here in FTA Region 9 office, we did sustain and over 1/3 of our workforce has departed as a result of different reasons. And the deferred resignation program was one of the draws for folks considering, their career decisions, life decisions and such. And so FTA is overall sustaining nearly 40% of workforce loss. And so we are really, trying to figure out how we are going to continue to do the best we can to support the public transportation, the transit operators and the grantees that we serve. And this is just, this is not the, I wouldn't want to say, so, the reduction in force implementation has not taken place yet. So we hope to not lose any more people, but that is, not, we are waiting to see what happens next.
Sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. Now, let me ask you a personal question. Are you part of the new administration or are you also from the old administration?
I'm a career employee here. I have been with the FTA for 20 years. So
you're still here. You're still.
We've been through different administrations, and yes, I have still chosen to stay in public service. Yes.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we're all glad that you're still here.
Thank you.
I don't speak for everyone, but at this moment, I feel like I need to. I would
Thank you very much.
give it back to our executive director. Do you have anything else before we wrap up our meeting?
Yes, Madam Chair, just a couple quick things. First, I just want to note, again, there are 2 additional workshops that do need to be scheduled. So we'll be working with you to get those scheduled. We're hoping that we can do the second one as part of a regular board meeting. And then we're going to be looking at potentially having to schedule a special one for our third and final workshop. But TBD, please keep an eye out for emails around that. And then I just want to just take a moment to give a round of applause for our fantastic speakers who've given us so much time this evening. We actually do have some gifts for them. So maybe you can give applause while I get the gifts.
Squishy right now, anyway. Oh, wow. Hey.
Amy, your gift is in the mail.
Got it, Yolo.
Thank you. No, not necessary, but thank you so much.
Amy, thank you so much. Yes, May is
I'd
by
like
socks.
months
Yes,
off.
of course. I really appreciate everyone for, these people have incredibly busy jobs, and for them to take this time out and spend time with us. And I just so appreciate you all so much for your service to our communities here in Yolo and everywhere that you serve. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned at 8:09 or 8:08.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.